Today, I'm going to tell you about the afternoon my aunt opened the guest room door, saw me standing there in one of her slips, and instead of yelling, said something so calm it scared me more than if she'd screamed. At the time, I still believed I could explain it away. A dumb mistake, stress, curiosity, a private thing that got out of hand for one stupid second. Little did I know, that instant was about to cleave my life in two. I was 28, doing remote IT support, fueled by caffeine and screen glare, and that subtle hum of loneliness you get so used to it fades into the background. My apartment required tenting after a pipe burst in the downstairs unit, turning the entire building into a mold even nobody wanted to address. My Aunt Sandra generously offered me a couple of weeks' stay. She resided alone in a small, immaculate house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where every object had its designated spot and emitted a perpetual, subtle scent of lemon cleaner and lavender. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was definitely precise, unflappable, the kind of woman who folded dish towels into perfect squares and never missed mailing birthday cards on time. Growing up, I'd always felt a tad intimidated by her. Not because she was unkind, but because she simply noticed everything. During that first week, I did my best to be as unobtrusive as possible. I worked from the guest room by day, assisted with grocery runs, and rinsed my plate the instant I finished eating. I kept reminding myself I was just passing through. Sleep, work, avoid making a mess, and spare her any regrets about offering. However, a quiet house can give your thoughts far too much space, particularly those you've deliberately avoided for years. It began innocently enough that I could still delude myself. One Thursday evening, she asked if I could transfer her laundry while she was at her garden club meeting. No problem. I lugged the warm clothes from the dryer, folding blouses and towels in the laundry room, trying hard to focus on completing the task. Then I picked up one of her garments. Soft, pale, delicate enough that I instinctively handled it differently. I should have just folded it and moved on. Instead, I stood there transfixed, staring at it in my hands as if it had suddenly interrupted a long-ignored thought. I struggled to articulate what I felt in that moment. It wasn't simple or straightforward. It wasn't some dramatic epiphany. It was more like a gentle tug, strangely familiar, embarrassingly familiar, as if I were recognizing an aspect of myself I had never dared to verbalize. I remember double-checking the hallway, though I knew I was alone. My heart thudded so loudly I felt foolish. Over and over I thought, don't do this. Fold it, put it away, act normal. But I didn't. I put it on. My hands were shaky and clumsy, and the instant it was on, blind panic struck so fast I nearly ripped it, taking it off. I stood there afterward, staring at my reflection in the dark window above the washer, breathing as if I'd just sprinted from something. What terrified me wasn't the act itself. It was the sensation underneath the panic. Relief. For the rest of the evening, I avoided eye contact with my aunt at the dinner table. I was certain she could somehow detect it on me, could see the very secret. But she only asked if I wanted more green beans and mentioned that one of her hydrangeas was struggling in the heat. And that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A couple of days later, I was brushing my teeth in the hall bathroom when I noticed a slip hanging behind the door. White, simple, the sort of article that likely wouldn't register with most people. It registered with me. I stood there with my toothbrush in hand for a solid minute, glaring at it as if it were there to accuse me. I told myself to leave. Instead, I locked the door. This time, the initial panic was lessened, replaced by more dread, more honesty. I slowly pulled it over my head as if waiting for my own conscience to kick in and stop me. The fabric was cool at first contact with my skin, then warm. It settled against me so lightly it barely felt tangible. I looked in the mirror. That's the part I still struggle to articulate plainly. I didn't see a joke or a costume. I didn't even see a convincing illusion. My shoulders were still too broad. My face was still my own. I looked uncertain, awkward, unfinished. Yet there was a softness about me that made my throat constrict. Not better, not prettier, just closer. Closer to what? I couldn't yet say. I only knew I couldn't dismiss what I saw, and I couldn't simply dismiss it. That was the instant it ceased to be random curiosity and began to feel dangerous, because I didn't have the vocabulary to explain why it felt so significant. I heard the front door open and nearly jumped out of my skin. I removed the slip, folded it clumsily, washed my face despite there being nothing on it, and returned to the guest room with my pulse pounding in my neck. The rest of the evening, I sat in front of my laptop feigning email responses while my thoughts fixated on the mirror, on the fact that I hadn't hated what I saw. Maybe that's the crux of it. Not that I wanted to wear her things exactly. It was that for a few moments, looking at myself didn't feel like simply enduring myself. It felt like listening. That's what made me reckless. A few days later, Sandra left in the afternoon to meet a friend for coffee. I told myself I was just going to shower, change, perhaps take a walk. Instead, I found myself standing in her hallway again, every disastrous decision already pre-made in my mind before I admitted it. I borrowed the slip, then one of her cardigans from the back of the closet. Just something soft to layer over it. Nothing extravagant, nothing I couldn't return precisely where I found it. Except once they were on, I lingered like that longer than intended. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, hands clasped in my lap, listening to the rhythmic rattle of the ancient ceiling fan above. An awful, impossible mix of shame and calm washed over me, like I was doing something wrong, but also deeply honest. Then I heard a car door slam outside. My stomach plummeted. She wasn't supposed to be back yet. I jumped up too quickly, snagged the hem of the slip, and nearly tripped in my haste to yank off the cardigan. By the time I reached the guest room door, it was already swinging inward. Sandra stood there, framed in the doorway. For a long, agonizing second, neither of us spoke. I remember every detail of that silence. The grocery bag dangling from her wrist, the late afternoon sunlight illuminating half her face, the way my own hands were clenched so tightly they ached. I braced myself for disgust, or anger, or that flat, wounded tone people use when they don't know what to do with you anymore. But instead, she just looked at me, really looked at me and said, so quietly, "You look more frightened of yourself than you do of me." I don't know why that sentence broke me, but it did. The apologies tumbled out too fast, barely coherent. I was sorry. I knew it was weird. I wasn't trying to steal anything. I'd put it all back. I could leave if she wanted. My face burned. I couldn't meet her eyes. I was already calculating how quickly I could throw my things in a bag and disappear. But she didn't raise her voice. She set the grocery bag on the dresser and closed the door behind her, not all the way, just enough to give us privacy without making it feel like a trap. "Michael," she said, her voice still calm. "Look at me." I did, barely. There was no anger in her face. And thank God, no amusement either. Just concern. And something else. Recognition, maybe. Not of the clothes, but of the fear. "Have you done this before?" she asked. I swallowed and nodded once. "Do you want to talk about it?" No one had ever asked me that question in a way that felt genuine, not as an accusation, not as a setup, just an opening. "I don't know," I said, the truth choking me. "I don't even know what this means." She took a breath and leaned lightly against the doorframe. "It may not mean everything all at once," she said. "It may only mean that something in you has been trying to be seen." It should have sounded corny. Coming from anyone else, it probably would have. But her tone was utterly without drama, plain and steady, like she was commenting on the weather or a draft from a cracked window. Tears stung my eyes, only adding to my embarrassment. "I know this is messed up." "No," she said gently. "It's private. It's painful. It's confusing. Those are not the same thing." I just stood there in her borrowed clothes, feeling like my whole body had been turned inside out. After a minute, she glanced at the cardigan sleeve I was clutching in my fist. "For what it's worth," she said, "sneaking around in things that don't fit you properly is only going to make this feel worse." I actually laughed then, one short, broken sound because I didn't know what else to do. It softened something between us. She didn't step closer, didn't crowd me. She just said, "You don't have to explain your whole life today. But you also don't have to stand here acting like I've caught you committing some terrible crime. I wiped at my face, humiliated by how shaky I felt. You're not disgusted? She gave me a look that was almost sad. At you? No. That no settled somewhere deep inside me. Then she opened her closet, reached to the back shelf, and pulled down a small storage box, setting it on the bed between us. Some of these are things I never wear anymore, she said. A few were your mother's. If you want to look through them later, privately, you can. If you don't, we'll close the box and never mention it until you're ready. I stared at the box as if it might vanish if I blinked. The fact that she wasn't pushing made it harder to run. She moved toward the door, then paused. And, Michael? Yeah. If you choose to try again, do it because it helps you understand yourself, not because shame has backed you into a corner. Then she left me there with the box and the sound of my own breathing. For a long time, I didn't touch anything. I just sat on the edge of the bed in that white slip and listened to the house settle around me, a floorboard popping in the hallway, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a dog barking twice and then falling silent somewhere outside. Normal sounds. Ordinary afternoon sounds. And there I was, feeling like the entire structure of my life had shifted 2 inches to the left. Eventually, I opened the box. Inside were a few soft blouses, a knit cardigan in pale blue, a simple sleep shirt, a pair of leggings, a wrapped package of unopened basics, and, at the very bottom, a small silver hair clip. Nothing flashy, nothing mocking, just clothes chosen by someone who had understood that I was already overwhelmed. I reached for the sleep shirt first. It was cotton, light and plain, the kind of thing no one would notice in a store. But when I held it up against myself, my hands stopped shaking so hard. This didn't feel like stealing. It didn't feel like trespassing inside someone else's life. It felt like I was being given room. That night, I barely slept, replaying the doorway, her face, that sentence, "You look more frightened of yourself than you do of me." The next morning, before I had time to talk myself out of it, I got up, showered, and opened the box again. This time, when I changed, I did it slowly, deliberately. Not like someone sneaking, but like someone trying to tell the truth in a language they'd only just started learning. And when I finally stood before the mirror, wearing clothes that someone had actually given me, not something I just grabbed, I saw that the fear hadn't gone away. But it wasn't the only thing I saw now. I placed my hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and opened the bedroom door. I found Sandra by the stove when I walked into the kitchen. A kettle was steaming on the burner, and she had one hand casually resting on the counter, as if she'd been expecting me but didn't want me to feel scrutinized. I was wearing the pale blue cardigan from the box over a soft sleep shirt and leggings, an odd combination that felt surprisingly right. Nothing fancy, nothing bold. Just comfortable clothes that seemed to match the quiet mood I was in better than anything I'd worn in ages. She glanced up once, taking me in, and offered a gentle smile, as if careful not to startle a bird. "Morning," she greeted. "Morning." That was it. No probing questions. No demands for conversation I wasn't ready for. She poured tea into 2 mugs and slid one towards me. I sat across from her, both hands wrapped around the warm cup, needing to ground myself somehow. After a moment, she observed, "You seem more at ease today." I glanced down at the sleeve pulled over part of my hand. "A little." She simply nodded. "That's what matters." We ate toast in near silence. I kept expecting the shame to come rushing back now the daylight was filling the room. I braced myself, thinking I might look down and feel ridiculous. Instead, I felt raw, exposed, but also strangely grounded. It was like I'd finally unclenched a muscle I hadn't even realized I was holding tight. When breakfast was done, Sandra rinsed her plate and said, almost offhandedly, "You don't have to borrow your courage one day at a time if you don't want to." I frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, drying her hands, "if you'd like to keep exploring this, we can make it less accidental. Get you some things of your own. A brush, toiletries, basics. Nothing too dramatic." The thought alone should have sent me running. Instead, I asked, "You'd really help me?" She gave me that same steady look. I told you I'd leave the door open. That afternoon, she drove to the pharmacy and a discount store in a neighboring town, the kind of place where we were both anonymous. I nearly chickened out twice before we even left the driveway. But Sandra kept up a steady stream of conversation during the drive, like we were off to do the most mundane errand in the world. Tomatoes for the garden, a sale on bath towels, the likelihood of rain by Thursday. Inside the store, she didn't hover or pressure me. She just gently guided me when I froze, overwhelmed. A simple hairbrush, face wash, a light moisturizer, a few pieces of clothing that were unequivocally mine. Soft, practical, almost unremarkable pieces that, strangely, made the whole thing feel more real than the slip ever had. When she held up a pale green top and asked hesitantly, "Too much?" I surprised myself by saying, "No, I actually like that one." Later, standing in the fitting room with my old clothes hanging on the hook, I stared at my reflection until my eyes burned. I still didn't have the words to describe what I was becoming. But I knew this. I didn't look like a man pretending in borrowed clothes. I looked vulnerable, possibly a bit scared, like someone at the beginning of a new chapter. Back at the house, the days settled into a rhythm. The change wasn't some sudden, dramatic transformation. It came in small increments, in quiet choices. Brushing my hair before breakfast. Choosing the green top because of the way it felt against my skin. Sitting on the porch in the evening, wrapped in a cardigan, while Sandra watered her herbs. Some mornings, I changed back into my old clothes before work. Some mornings, I didn't. Sandra never pushed. She simply noticed. One evening, while we were folding laundry, she asked casually, "Have you ever thought about another name?" I nearly dropped a towel. "No, that might not be entirely true," she said gently. I laughed softly under my breath because she was right. There had been names over the years, secret little fantasies I'd never allowed to fully form. She kept folding. "You don't need one today. I'm just saying. Sometimes a name helps people see themselves more clearly. It should have felt like too much, but it didn't." The thought lingered with me the rest of the night. And the next morning, when she knocked lightly on the guest room door and said, "Tea's ready," she added, after the briefest of pauses, "I was thinking, Jane might suit you." I stood there in the doorway in my leggings and a long cream sweater, my pulse racing in my throat. "Jane," I repeated. "It's just a thought," she said. "You can discard it." But I didn't. At breakfast, she used it once, softly, naturally, as if testing whether it would shatter upon being spoken aloud. Something inside me both soared and trembled at the same time. The strangest part wasn't hearing it. It was realizing I wanted to hear it again. A few days later, the first real test came sooner than I was ready for. Sandra's neighbor Helen stopped by with a basket of tomatoes from her garden. I had just come from the laundry room wearing jeans that actually fit and a lavender sweater I'd started reaching for without thinking. My hair was clipped back with the silver clip from the box. I heard the knock and felt a sudden wave of anxiety. "I should change," I whispered urgently. Sandra was already heading for the door. "There's no time." Panic clawed at my throat. "Sandra," she turned, her expression gentle but firm. "Do you want to hide?" I opened my mouth and found, to my own surprise, that I didn't. Helen breezed in, smelling faintly of sunscreen and freshly cut grass. She glanced at me, smiled politely, and then turned back to Sandra. "Oh, I didn't realize your niece was visiting." Sandra didn't miss a beat. "This is Jane. She's staying with me for a while." Helen's smile widened. "Well, it's lovely to meet you, Jane." I simply nodded, my voice having completely deserted me. But I didn't correct her. I didn't run. I stood there while they chatted about the weather, canning, and a church rummage sale, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it throbbing in my wrists. Then Helen laughed. Nothing exploded. No one laughed. The world kept turning. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table after the door closed and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside me for days. Sandra placed the tomatoes in a bowl. "You did fine." I looked at her, still trying to steady myself. She believed it. Sandra's expression softened. "Maybe because you did too." After that, the idea of going outside didn't seem quite as impossible. Not easy, mind you, just possible. I started small with the porch, then the mailbox. Then, one late afternoon, Sandra and I walked to the end of the driveway and back while the sky blazed gold above the road. It might have seemed like a small thing, but it felt enormous. The real test came 2 weeks later. I was in the kitchen by myself, wearing a soft blue dress Sandra had helped me pick out on our second trip into town when the doorbell rang. I figured it was a package. It was Eric, my old college roommate. He stood there, a six-pack in one hand and a look of confusion already spreading across his face. "Hey," he said. "I was in the area. Is Michael around?" Hearing the old name hit me like a physical blow. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. I could see a million ways the moment could fall apart. Before I could say anything, Sandra appeared behind me. "He doesn't live here anymore," she said calmly, "but Jane does. Would you like to come in for a minute?" Eric looked back and forth between her and me. I braced myself for the smirk, the double take, the dawning recognition turning cruel. Instead, he stepped inside and said carefully, "Sorry, I guess I just got turned around." We sat in the living room and made awkward small talk for 10 minutes. His eyes kept coming back to my face, like he was trying to place a dream he'd had years ago, but he never pushed. When he left, he shook my hand and said, "Nice meeting you, Jane." After the door closed, I stood in the hallway staring at my reflection in the mirror by the coat rack. My cheeks were pale. A strand of hair had come loose on one side. My hands were shaking. But beneath the fear, something clearer than anything I'd felt before was there. I hadn't wanted to become Michael again, just to make things easier for him. That was important. The final shift happened on a rainy morning not long after. Sandra was reading in her chair. I was by the window, warming my hands on a mug of tea, watching the rain run down the glass. I was wearing leggings, an oversized sweater, no makeup, my hair pulled back. There was nothing polished or put on about me. I was just there. And I knew. "I don't think I'm going back," I said. Sandra didn't pretend not to understand. "Back where?" I looked out at the rain. To living as him. At least, not the way I was. She closed her book, holding her place with one finger, and nodded once like some part of her had been waiting for me to catch up to the truth. "All right," she said. No big speech, no dramatic hug. Just that. All right, 6 months later, I had a small rental cottage 15 minutes away, and a job where everyone knew me as Jane. Not because I made some grand announcement. I just stopped answering to the life that no longer fit. Sandra and I still had tea every Sunday. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things, grocery lists, the weather, which plants were struggling on her back porch. Sometimes we talked about fear. Mostly, we didn't need to. I used to think that what happened in her house was the beginning of a new person. Now I think it was something quieter than that. I think a locked room inside me finally opened, and instead of telling me to be ashamed, the first person who saw it simply made space for it. I didn't become Jane all at once. I arrived there slowly. In a guest room. In a kitchen. At a mailbox. In the silence after someone said the right name, and I realized it belonged to me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to look away.